He had 2 of his wives publicly executed. He divorced 2 others, casting them aside like worn-out clothes. A 5th died in the very act of giving him what he craved most, and the 6th, the survivor, only escaped the executioner's axe by a hair's breadth. 6 queens, all bound to one man's terrifying obsession. This is the story of Henry VIII. But it's not just a story of 6 marriages. It is the story of an insatiable ego, a kingdom held hostage by a king's fragile masculinity, and a desperate blood-soaked quest for a son. And the most savage, condensed period of this madness, the vortex that would consume 4 of those wives, and define his tyrannical legacy, unfolded in just 8 brutal years. To understand how a man once called the Golden Prince of the Renaissance became a monster, you have to understand the curse he believed he was living under. It all began with his first queen, a woman of immense dignity and unshakable faith, Catherine of Aragon. She was a Spanish princess, the daughter of the legendary Ferdinand and Isabella, who had funded Columbus. She was originally betrothed to Henry's older brother, Arthur. Their marriage was meant to seal a powerful alliance between England and Spain, but just 5 months after the wedding, tragedy struck. Arthur, the heir to the throne, died suddenly, likely from the sweating sickness, a terrifying and mysterious disease that could kill a healthy person in hours. This left the teenage Henry as the new heir, and Catherine a young widow trapped in a foreign land. A new plan was hatched. Henry would marry his brother's widow. But there was a problem, a huge one. Church law, based on a passage in the book of Leviticus, expressly forbade a man from marrying his brother's wife. It was considered incest, a mortal sin. The Bible was clear. If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. They shall be childless. To get around this, a special permission, a papal dispensation, was required from the Pope himself. The argument made to the Pope was that Catherine's marriage to Arthur was never consummated. Catherine swore this was true for the rest of her life. The Pope, under political pressure from both Spain and England, granted the dispensation. And so, in 1509, the newly crowned King Henry VIII, a handsome, athletic, and charismatic 18-year-old, married the 23-year-old Catherine of Aragon. For nearly 2 decades, their marriage was, by all public accounts, a successful one. Henry respected her intelligence and often left her in charge of the kingdom as regent when he was away on military campaigns. He flaunted her as his queen, and she, in turn, adored him. But behind the tapestries of the royal court, a quiet horror was unfolding in the royal nursery. The curse of Leviticus, the one they thought they had sidestepped, seemed to be coming true. In 1510, Catherine gave birth to a stillborn daughter. A year later, on New Year's Day 1511, bells pealed across London. A son was born, Henry, Duke of Cornwall. The kingdom celebrated wildly. Henry threw lavish tournaments in honor of his heir, but the joy was tragically short-lived. Just 52 days later, the baby prince was dead. The cause was unknown. The silence in the royal apartments must have been deafening. More pregnancies followed. A son born in 1513 lived only a few hours. Another son in 1514 was either miscarried or stillborn. It was a relentless, heartbreaking cycle of hope and despair. With each loss, Henry's anxiety grew. It began to fester, morphing into a dark religious conviction. He was being punished by God. The words from Leviticus echoed in his mind, "They shall be childless." He had defied God's law, and this was his divine retribution. In 1516 there was a glimmer of hope. Catherine gave birth to a healthy baby. But it was a girl, Princess Mary. While Henry loved his daughter, in the brutal world of 16th-century monarchies, a daughter was not an heir. A king needed a son to secure his dynasty, to prevent the chaos of a succession crisis and civil war, a horror that was still fresh in English memory from the Wars of the Roses. As the years passed, Catherine aged. The multiple pregnancies took their toll. By the mid-1520s, she was in her 40s, past what was then considered childbearing age. Henry was still in his prime, but he was staring down the barrel of a dynastic crisis. His obsession for a son became all-consuming, and it was at this exact moment of peak vulnerability, of spiritual crisis and political desperation, that a new woman walked into the king's line of sight. A woman who would not be his mistress, a woman who would offer him a solution, and in doing so, would set in motion a chain of events that would tear England apart. Her name was Anne Boleyn. Anne was not a conventional beauty of the time. She wasn't blonde and pale-skinned. She was dark with piercing black eyes, a long, elegant neck, and an electrifying wit. She had spent her formative years in the sophisticated courts of France and was stylish, intelligent, and possessed a captivating, almost arrogant, self-confidence that set her apart from the other English court ladies. Henry, who was used to women fawning over him, was instantly intrigued. He began to pursue her, writing her a series of passionate, almost desperate love letters that still survive today. But Anne did something audacious. She refused him. Not outright, but she refused to become his mistress, a role her own sister Mary had previously filled. Anne had seen what happened to discarded royal mistresses. She was playing a much bigger game. She wanted to be queen, or nothing. This refusal, this challenge to his royal will, only fanned the flames of Henry's desire. He became utterly infatuated. Anne, a shrewd and ambitious woman with reformist religious leanings, presented him with an electrifying idea. What if his marriage to Catherine wasn't just cursed, but had been invalid from the very beginning? What if the Pope had never had the authority to grant the dispensation in the first place? What if, in the eyes of God, he had never been married to Catherine at all? For Henry, this was a revelation. It was the perfect solution. It wasn't him who was at fault, it was the Pope. His conscience could be cleared. He could annul his marriage to Catherine, marry Anne, and God would surely grant him the healthy son he deserved. He called this his great matter, but getting an annulment was not so simple. The Pope Clement V was now effectively a prisoner of Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Charles was the most powerful man in Europe, and he was not about to stand by and see his aunt cast aside, and humiliated, her daughter Mary declared a bastard. For 7 long years, Henry tried to persuade, bribe, and threaten the Pope into granting his annulment. He sent envoys to Rome, he cited obscure biblical passages, he gathered opinions from universities across Europe, but Rome would not yield. Catherine of Aragon, for her part, fought for her marriage and her daughter's rights with a strength and dignity that was nothing short of heroic. She was brought before a special court in England, presided over by a papal legate. In a moment of high drama, she knelt at Henry's feet and gave a powerful speech, pleading her case, reminding him of her loyalty and love, and swearing on her soul that her marriage to his brother had never been consummated. Henry was moved, but he was not swayed. His obsession had grown too large. As his frustration mounted, Anne Boleyn and a circle of radical reformers, including men like Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer, pushed him towards a more drastic solution. If the Pope would not give him what he wanted, he should simply reject the Pope's authority altogether. He should declare himself the supreme head of the Church in England. It was an idea that was both terrifying and intoxicating. It would give him the power to grant his own annulment. It would give him access to the immense wealth of the monasteries. It would make him an absolute ruler in both a spiritual and temporal sense. In 1533, the dam broke. Anne Boleyn was pregnant. There was no more time to wait. Henry, guided by his new Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, secretly married Anne. Then, Cranmer declared Henry's marriage to Catherine null and void from the beginning. Catherine was stripped of her title as queen and banished from court, forced to live in a series of damp, isolated castles, forbidden from seeing her daughter Mary. A few days later, Anne Boleyn was crowned Queen of England, in a magnificent ceremony at Westminster Abbey. This act of defiance was the beginning of the English Reformation. Henry broke with the Roman Catholic Church, a connection that had existed for over 1,000 years. He forced his subjects to take an oath recognizing him as the head of the Church. Those who refused, like his brilliant and loyal Chancellor Sir Thomas More, were executed for treason. Henry had gotten what he wanted. He had his new queen, and she was pregnant with what he was certain was his long-awaited son. The kingdom held its breath. In September 1533, Anne gave birth. But when the child was brought to the waiting king, his world shattered once again. It was another girl, a healthy, red-haired baby named Elizabeth. Henry's disappointment was immense, and he did not hide it. He had torn his kingdom from its spiritual foundations, risked damnation, and all for another daughter. This was the moment the tide began to turn against Anne. Her failure to produce a son was her original sin in Henry's eyes. Her sharp tongue and fiery temper which he had once found so captivating, now began to grate on him. She meddled in politics and religion, making powerful enemies at court who were just waiting for her to stumble. The pressure on her was unbearable. Another pregnancy in 1534 probably ended in a miscarriage. Then, in January 1536, a final, catastrophic blow. Catherine of Aragon died in her lonely exile. On the day of Catherine's funeral, Anne miscarried again. When the panicked midwives examined the fetus, they saw it was a boy. When news reached the king, his fury was volcanic. He stormed into Anne's chamber, screaming at her. Some reports say he yelled, "I see that God will not give me a male child." He had convinced himself that Anne had bewitched him into the marriage. His love, once so all-consuming, had curdled into a deadly hatred. He wanted her gone, but he couldn't just annul this marriage. That would make his daughter Elizabeth illegitimate, just like Mary. It would mean admitting that his entire break with Rome, his great matter, was a sham. No, Anne had to be removed in a way that left no doubt about her guilt. She had to be guilty of something so heinous that it would justify her destruction and leave Henry blameless. His chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, a man of ruthless efficiency, was tasked with finding a way. And he did. Within a few short weeks, a plot was constructed. A series of shocking accusations were leveled against Queen Anne. She was accused of adultery with 5 men, including a court musician named Mark Smeaton. And most horrifically, of incest with her own brother, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford. The charge was that she had conspired with her lovers to bring about the king's death. This was treason. The evidence was flimsy, based on whispers, conjecture, and confessions extracted under torture. Mark Smeaton, the musician, confessed, likely after being subjected to horrific pain. The other men, all aristocrats, denied the charges vehemently. But it didn't matter. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. The trials were a sham. Anne and her brother were tried by a jury of their peers. A jury that included their own uncle and a man she had once been betrothed to. They were, of course, found guilty. Anne was sentenced to be burned or beheaded at the king's pleasure. In a final twisted act of mercy, Henry spared her the flames and, as a nod to her time in France, ordered an expert swordsman to be brought over from Calais to perform the execution, as a sword was considered a more dignified and less messy instrument than the clumsy English executioner's axe. On the morning of May 19, 1536, less than 3 years after she was crowned queen, Anne Boleyn walked to a scaffold erected on the Tower Green. She was calm and composed. She gave a short, careful speech, cleverly avoiding any admission of guilt, but also avoiding any criticism of the king. She asked the crowd to pray for her and for the king, the most goodly and gentle prince that is. She knelt down, her black eyes still full of life. She said the words, "To Jesus Christ, I commend my soul." The French swordsman, as was the custom, was supposed to distract the victim, perhaps by calling for his sword so the blow would come as a surprise. He did, and in one swift, silent movement, it was over. Anne Boleyn was dead. Her head and body were placed in an old arrow chest and buried in an unmarked grave in the Tower Chapel. Henry had erased her, or so he thought. The very next day, Henry VIII obtained a special license to marry again. And just 10 days after Anne's execution, he was wed. His new bride was Jane Seymour. Jane was everything Anne was not. She was quiet, gentle, and meek. Her family motto was, "Bound to obey and serve." She was the perfect antidote to the fiery, troublesome Anne. For Henry, she represented a return to order, a soft and comforting presence. And in October 1537, she did what 2 queens before her had failed to do. She gave birth to a son, a healthy, living son, Prince Edward. The celebrations were ecstatic. Henry was overjoyed, triumphant. He had been vindicated. His struggle, the schism, the bloodshed, it had all been worth it. God had finally blessed him, but his joy was to be cruelly, brutally brief. The birth had been long and arduous. Soon after, Jane fell gravely ill with what was likely puerperal fever, a common and deadly post-childbirth infection. The palace physicians were helpless. Just 12 days after fulfilling her one and only duty, Queen Jane Seymour was dead. Henry was, by all accounts, genuinely devastated. He had finally found his perfect queen, the mother of his heir, and she was snatched away from him. He wore black for months and commanded that when he died, He was to be buried next to her in state, George's Chapel at Windsor. She was, he would always say, his only true wife. For 2 years Henry remained a widower, consumed by grief and the business of state. But the need for a spare heir, and for a powerful European alliance, was pressing. His minister, Thomas Cromwell, who had orchestrated the fall of Anne Boleyn, now orchestrated a new marriage. He pushed for an alliance with the Protestant princes of Germany to create a bulwark against the Catholic powers of France and Spain. The chosen bride was a German noblewoman, Anne of Cleves. Cromwell commissioned the great court painter, Hans Holbein the Younger, to paint a portrait of the prospective bride. Holbein, a master of his craft, painted a flattering image of a demure and pretty young woman. Henry saw the portrait and was pleased. He agreed to the marriage. The deal was struck. Anne of Cleves began her long journey to England, and this is where one of the most awkward and humiliating episodes in English royal history begins. Henry, ever the romantic, decided to surprise his new bride. He was in his late 40s now, no longer the handsome athlete of his youth. He was massively overweight, balding, and suffered from a painful, festering ulcer on his leg that gave off a foul stench. But his ego remained as large as ever. He disguised himself and burst into the room where Anne was waiting at Rochester. He expected her to be overcome with joy, to instantly recognize her magnificent Prince Charming beneath his disguise. But Anne had no idea who this large older man was. She had been raised in a small formal German court, and had none of the flirtatious sophistication of the French or English ladies. She stared at him confused and then turned away. Henry's ego was completely shattered. He was horrified. He left the room in a rage, complaining to his attendants, "I like her not. I like her not." It wasn't just her looks, though he famously complained about her to Cromwell, making crude remarks about her body. It was her lack of refinement, her foreign ways, and most importantly, the fact that she hadn't immediately fallen for him. The political situation had also shifted. An alliance with the German princes was suddenly no longer necessary. Henry was trapped. He had to go through with the wedding. The ceremony was a grim, joyless affair. The wedding night was a disaster. Henry later claimed in excruciating detail before his council that he had been unable to consummate the marriage. He said he had left her, as good a maid as I found her. He needed a way out, and quickly. Thomas Cromwell, the man who had arranged the disastrous match, was now in the firing line. His enemies at court, who despised him for his low birth and his reformist policies, saw their chance. They blamed him for the entire fiasco. Henry, looking for a scapegoat, was all too willing to listen. Cromwell was arrested, charged with treason and heresy, and executed without a trial. Just a few months after his grand political marriage, Henry had it annulled. The legal grounds were flimsy. A supposed pre-contract that Anne had with another man, and most embarrassingly for the king, the non-consummation. Anne of Cleves, however, played her part brilliantly. Unlike Catherine of Aragon, she did not fight the annulment. She meekly agreed to the king's wishes, a decision that probably saved her life. For her cooperation, Henry was surprisingly generous. He gave her a handsome settlement, several royal palaces, and the honorary title of King's beloved sister. She lived out the rest of her days in England in wealth and comfort, outliving Henry and all his other wives. She had, in a sense, won the lottery. She had been Queen of England, and had gotten away with her life and a fortune. But Henry's humiliation needed a balm, and he found it in the arms of a new young woman, a teenager. Her name was Catherine Howard. Catherine Howard was Anne Boleyn's first cousin, but she was a world away from her in terms of intellect and experience. She was young, barely out of her teens, vivacious, and by all accounts, very pretty. Henry, now nearly 50, obese, and in constant pain from his leg, was completely besotted. He called her his rose without a thorn, his jewel of womanhood. He showered her with gifts and paraded her at court. For a brief period, the old king seemed young again. He felt revitalized, his monumental ego restored. But Catherine had a past. And in the viper's nest of the Tudor court, secrets were a currency and a weapon. Catherine had been raised in the lax household of her grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. There she had engaged in youthful dalliances, first with her music teacher, Henry Manox, and then a more serious affair with a gentleman named Francis Dereham. This was dangerous enough, but the real trouble began after she became queen. Young, foolish, and likely terrified of her aging and intimidating husband, she made a catastrophic error. She began a reckless flirtation, and then a full-blown affair, with one of Henry's favourite young courtiers, a man named Thomas Culpeper. She also made the mistake of appointing Francis Dereham, her old flame, as her private secretary. It was a ticking time bomb. It was only a matter of time before someone talked. And someone did. A woman who had served with Catherine in the Duchess's household revealed the Queen's past to the Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. Cranmer, knowing this was explosive information, at first didn't dare to tell the king directly. He passed him a note during Mass. Henry initially refused to believe it. This was his perfect rose, his virtuous young queen. It had to be a lie, a vicious rumour spread by his enemies. He ordered an investigation, certain it would clear her name. But it didn't. The evidence was overwhelming. Investigators found Henry Manox and Francis Dereham. They confessed to their premarital relationships with Catherine. Then they found love letters from Catherine to Thomas Culpeper, letters that spoke of her desire to be with him. When Henry was presented with the undeniable proof of his wife's infidelity, both before and during their marriage, his reaction was terrifying. The love and adoration he had felt for Catherine curdled into a volcanic, murderous rage. He is said to have wept with self-pity, roaring and bellowing, calling for a sword so he could kill her himself. The fall was swift and brutal. Culpeper and Dereham were arrested and tortured. Dereham was subjected to the full, horrific punishment for treason. He was hanged, drawn and quartered. Culpeper, due to his aristocratic status, was granted the mercy of a simple beheading. Their heads were stuck on spikes on London Bridge. Catherine herself was imprisoned in the Tower of London. She was said to have been hysterical with terror. There is a famous, though likely embellished, story that she escaped her guards at Hampton Court and ran screaming down the gallery towards the chapel where Henry was at prayers, only to be dragged away before she could reach him. A Bill of Attainder was passed by Parliament, a legal instrument that allowed a person to be declared guilty of a crime without a trial. On the 13th of February, 1542, just a year and a half after her wedding, Catherine Howard, still a teenager, was led to the same spot on Tower Green, where her cousin Anne Boleyn had died. She was reportedly so weak with fear, she had to be helped up the scaffold. She made a short speech, confessing her sins and asking for prayers. Then, like her cousin before her, she was executed. The rose without a thorn had been crushed. This marked the end of that chaotic 8-year period. 4 wives in 8 years. 1 divorced, 1 dead from natural causes, 2 beheaded. Henry was now a broken man. He was in his 50s, morbidly obese, in constant agony from his ulcerated leg. His youthful charisma was long gone, replaced by a deep-seated paranoia and a fearsome temper. He had his precious son, Edward, but the personal cost had been immense. He would marry one more time. His 6th and final wife was Catherine Parr. She was a mature, twice widowed woman in her early 30s, chosen more as a companion and a nurse than as a bride for passion or procreation. Catherine Parr was intelligent, kind, and devout Protestant with strong reformist beliefs. She was a loving stepmother to Henry's 3 children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, and did much to reconcile them with their father. She created a semblance of a stable family life in the king's final years. But even she was not safe. Her strong Protestant faith made her a target for the conservative faction at court, led by Bishop Stephen Gardiner. They saw her influence over the king as a threat. They began to plot against her, whispering in the king's ear that his wife was a heretic. They compiled evidence against her and incredibly convinced the paranoid old king to sign an arrest warrant. The plan was to arrest the queen and search her chambers for heretical books. This would have been a death sentence, but Catherine got lucky. Someone loyal to her found out about the warrant and warned her. What she did next showed her incredible intelligence and courage. She didn't panic or flee. She went to Henry. She approached him humbly, and when he brought up the subject of religion, she played her part perfectly. She said she only discussed such matters with him to learn from his great wisdom, and to distract him from the pain of his leg. She flattered his ego, telling him it was not for a woman to instruct her husband, but to be instructed by him. Henry was completely charmed. He told her, "And is it even so, sweetheart? Then we are perfect friends again." The next day, When the guards arrived in the palace garden to arrest the queen, Henry flew into a rage, berating them and sending them away. Catherine Parr had survived. She had looked into the abyss and talked her way out. She would go on to outlive the king. Henry VIII died in January 1547, aged 55. His massive body had to be encased in a lead-lined coffin filled with spices to contain the smell of its decomposition. He was buried, as he had requested all those years ago, next to Jane Seymour, the wife who had given him his son. And so, we are left with the great, lingering question. Was it all worth it? All the chaos, the terror, the executions, the sundering of his kingdom from the church. All for a son. His son, Edward VI, did indeed become king. But he was a sickly boy. He reigned for only 6 years before dying at the age of 15, without an heir of his own. The dynasty Henry had fought so violently to secure seemed to die with him. But this is where history delivers its most profound and delicious irony. After Edward's death and a brief, failed attempt to place a Protestant cousin on the throne, the crown passed to the first daughter he had cast aside. Catherine of Aragon's daughter, Mary, became Queen Mary I. Her reign was fraught with religious strife, as she tried violently to return England to Catholicism, earning her the name Bloody Mary. And after Mary died childless just 5 years later, the throne passed to the other daughter he had discarded, the daughter of the executed Anne Boleyn, the baby girl whose birth had been such a bitter disappointment, Elizabeth I, and it was Elizabeth who would go on to rule for over 44 years. Her reign becoming known as a golden age. She was a brilliant, pragmatic and powerful monarch who steered England to become a major world power. She never married, using her single status as a political tool, and secured the very stability her father had craved. The ultimate legacy of Henry VIII, the king who moved heaven and earth for a son, was not the short-lived reign of that son, but the glorious, transformative reign of the daughter he never wanted, his insane, bloody quest for a male heir ultimately. And ironically, paved the way for 2 of the most powerful queens in English history. His legacy is a chilling testament to the destructive power of obsession, and a powerful reminder that fate and history often have a way of writing their own unexpected endings.